Welcome, everyone. My name is Francesca Yocorto, and I'm an advisory board member of the Pearson Centre. I'm also the Senior Director of Public Affairs at the National Airlines Council of Canada. As many of you will know, the Pearson Centre is a progressive think tank that addresses the big economic and social challenges of the day. In that context, I'm pleased to welcome you to the 25th webinar on major policy issues related to COVID-19 and how they are affecting our society. Our ongoing project is called COVID and Beyond, recognizing that we have a lot of issues to address as we plan for the recovery and rebuilding that will be slow and long. This will also be an important time to reimagine Canada. However, before we go on to today's program, I'd just like to take a moment to thank our sponsors who make these events possible. Our event sponsor for today is Stratejm Inc., which is a cybersecurity company based in Mississauga, Ontario. And of course, our sustaining sponsors are Canada's Building Trades Unions and the International Association of Firefighters. So a very big thank you to all three organizations. Today, our subject is cybersecurity for the remote workplace, looking at security in the time of COVID and beyond. We have four very knowledgeable panelists who will address these issues today. We have with us John McKay, who's the Member of Parliament for Scarborough-Guildwood, and he's currently chair, or was chair up until the time of a prorogation of the important House of Commons Committee on Public Safety and National Security. Cybersecurity is high on the committee's agenda. We also have with us today John Menezes, who is President and CEO of Stratejm Inc. He is the leader and innovator in the field of cloud-based cybersecurity services. Notably, the company has developed a leading security as a service platform and is recognized as an industry leader in cyber and data security. We also have with us today Dinah Maxwell, who's Senior Legal Counsel, Privacy Lead at PwC Canada. She is a Toronto-based legal expert and thought leader in privacy, data governance, and cybersecurity. And last but by no means least, we have with us today Imran Ahmad, who is a partner at Cassels Graydon LLP, where he specializes in technology, cybersecurity, and privacy law. As part of his cybersecurity practice, he works with clients to implement practical strategies related to cyber threats and data breaches. The panel will be moderated by Brian Galland, who, as many of you will know, served as New Brunswick 33rd Premier, and Brian also serves as an advisory board member of the Pearson Centre. But much more than that, he currently wears three additional hats, which I will share with you now. One is he is Special Advisor on Innovation, Cybersecurity, and Law to the President of Ryerson University. That's one. Another, he is also CEO of the New Centre for the Purpose of the Corporation at Navigator Limited. And he also is a board member of the Rogers Cybersecure Catalyst. So Brian, you are obviously a very busy man. I'm very delighted that you were able to find the time to be with us today. With respect to the format, the panel discussion will last about 40 minutes and then be followed by a Q&A period before we wrap up promptly at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Please use the question box on your screen and we will get to as many questions as we can. With that, I will hand it over to you, Brian.
Thank you so much, Francesca. Merci beaucoup à vous tous et toutes d'être parmi nous. Merci beaucoup aux panélistes aussi d'être là. We really appreciate the phenomenal panelists that we have, great breadth of experience, skill sets, and I'm sure insight. So we're very excited to hear from you as well. So just to repeat what Francesca said, please do send in some questions in the chat, and we would look forward around the 40-minute mark to entertain some of your questions and get the feedback from the panelists. Alors, s'il vous plaît, partagez vos questions. Et ça nous fait plaisir de partager ça avec les panélistes. So we're very excited to get started. A very relevant topic for sure, given everything that's been going on over the last few months and the amount of people that are working from home. So to set the stage, I'm going to start off with a very general question. What was the state of cybersecurity in Canada pre-COVID? And this will just at least give everybody a sense of maybe where things were at. I'm sure there were still challenges at that point. And then it will certainly be a great launching pad to discuss how COVID and the pandemic and of course the increase in homework has had an impact. So as was mentioned, we do want to hear from all the panelists. So I'll sort of maybe start it off with John Menezes, if you want to take this question, and then we'll go to Dinah after that and continue around to the other panelists.
That's great. Thanks, Brian. The digital transformation that has been taking place in Canada and around the world for the last decade has meant that cybersecurity has been an important topic for everybody. However, until about 5 or 7 years ago, people didn't take cybersecurity very seriously. It's only when we had some major breaches in the last 5 to 7 years and millions of consumer data was stolen and available on the cyber black market did people start taking cybersecurity seriously. The other big issue that we had with cybersecurity is always viewed as a technology issue. So it was always the people in IT, the cybersecurity geeks that were responsible for cybersecurity. And so, businesses were not investing in cybersecurity as part of their investment programs. What has happened in the last 3 years is that cybersecurity has now become a business problem. So it's at all the board meetings. So when you go to the board of directors, they're asking about, what is the state of cybersecurity within our organization? And that has kind of changed the momentum of cybersecurity. So now it's a business problem. It has great visibility. And with visibility at the board level, we're finding that now investments are being made and people are talking a lot more about cybersecurity than they were. So that was kind of the state where we found ourselves on March 15 before the COVID-19 shutdown.
Very interesting. Thank you, John. Dinah.
Yes, so from a privacy legal perspective, I think a lot of the issues that organizations were focusing on prior to COVID are still very relevant today. Perhaps the risk is a bit more heightened now, and we'll get into those risks later on in the discussion. But I think in terms of some hot topic issues that organizations were really focused on, I would say that definitely compliance with multiple jurisdictions' privacy laws was of key concern. Certainly compliance with the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, as well as compliance with the European Data Protection Law, the General Data Protection Regulation, was certainly front of mind for a lot of organizations in terms of getting their ducks in a row and making sure they comply not only with Canadian privacy requirements, but also those of other jurisdictions in which those organizations conduct business. So I think the compliance piece has been very much a focus, as well as cross-border data transfers and ensuring that contractual terms are in place to ensure the safe and ethical transfer of data outside of Canada. It has always been a live issue and definitely was one of my priorities prior to our new normal coming into play. And then I also think just generally across multiple sectors, there's been more of a focus on building out not just a privacy and cybersecurity practice or focus within the organization, but also a data use governance focus. So building out privacy programs that focus not only on the privacy and cybersecurity components, but also what is the ethical use of using data? If we're legally allowed to use this data, should we be using it for various business purposes? So I think all of those issues are very much at play still, but certainly our focus, at least in the private sector, has definitely shifted in the past 6 months or so.
Very interesting. Thank you for that, Dinah. Imran.
So just a couple of things. We have a sort of a unique vantage point as a firm where we can see nationally certain trend lines emerging over time. We have the benefit of looking year over year what was going on in cyber, especially on the incident response side. This is when an organization gets hacked into and are dealing with a cybersecurity incident. So what I can tell you is pre-COVID, we had seen a commercialization of cyber criminality. You had more and more criminal gangs at a very low cost of entry, no barrier to entry to enter this marketplace, who are then targeting organizations. So if you look between 2016 to 2020 pre-COVID, year in, year out, the number had been just from a pure numbers perspective increased. That's just in terms of the empirical data. What we had also seen was the impact on the Canadian economy, which was underreported, quite frankly, was quite significant. I remind a lot of our audience members here, Canada is still by and large a mid-market economy. You know, the backbone of our economy is SMBs and others. And so when they get impacted and are shut down for weeks on end recovering from an incident, there's a real financial loss associated with it in terms of lack of productivity, lack of opportunity, and so on. So the situation wasn't great. Sort of anecdotally, one thing I sort of point out to clients is pick up the newspaper and you'll see how many Canada-specific cases are now being reported, which was not the case even 5 years ago. 5 years ago, it's a bit like John mentioned, you would hear about the big mega breaches, which had multi-jurisdictional components, primarily in the US with a global reach, but you had seen more and more Canadian cases being reported on either in the media or otherwise. And that's actually confirmed with the privacy piece that Dinah touched on earlier as well, which is we now have mandatory reporting obligation. The Privacy Commissioner released a report. It was a 600% increase in terms of reportable incidents. And these are just the incidents that were reported. So by and large, the situation was getting worse in terms of impact on organizations and the sheer number that were increasing.
Fascinating. And I'm excited to get to the next questions about how the pandemic has had an impact. Mr. John McKay.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks for the invitation to be here. My answer is twofold. Pre-pandemic was very little, and post-pandemic, nothing at all. The engagement by Parliament in this issue has been sporadic, and I know our committee at one point was quite engaged, and we did file a report, and it was a bit of an eye-opener, but regrettably, politicians chase rabbits down rabbit holes, and to be candid with you, since the pandemic started, there's been virtually no committee doing anything. Even my own committee was engaged with what was I consider to be a really good study on systemic racism in the policing, but nothing in this area. I would hope that post-prorogation that will change. I would, one of the reasons I said to Andrew, I want to be on this panel, is to see if I can get the robust public discussion, which I think is actually quite robust, as evidenced by the three people that spoke prior to me, would translate into a more robust parliamentary discussion, because this field is moving at lightning speed, and Parliament, in my judgment, is moving at glacial speed.
Well, it's fascinating to think about how global events of the past have certainly been reference points for great change and maybe an enhancement on certain things in terms of focus. So it will be, I think, important for us, and I think the Pearson Center has recognized that and seized this opportunity to talk about these issues and how that the pandemic can be served as a catalyst to improve things. And obviously, cybersecurity, I'm sure all of you will make the point, is one of the things that should be that focus. So with that, let's get to the pandemic and really the impact that that's had. So Imran, we'll start with you, if that's all right. Since the pandemic, of course, many people are now working from home. Obviously, many people think that this trend will probably continue even post-pandemic in certain ways, if not in a very significant way. What implications has this had from a cybersecurity point of view in the country?
That's a good question, Brian. The way we look at it, it's a triangle when you look at what cyber criminals are trying to take advantage of. So if you imagine a triangle, at each tip you have either hardware, software, or data. And what these threat actors, these hackers are trying to do is take advantage of one or more of those points of entry into the system. So pre-COVID, you had the situation we just described. We were tracking some data points in the study we released for 2019. So I can give you a bit of a compare and contrast. What was interesting is we saw moving a large workforce to a remote environment led to two or three things. Either the hackers were taking advantage of the hardware in some respects. You have your personal laptop that you're using to access, for example, work resources, or you have a work laptop that you're also using for whatever reason for personal use as well. That made it very easy for threat actors to take advantage of certain situations. On the software side of things, quite frankly, we only have so much bandwidth within an organization. At that point, migrating large workforces to remote working is a priority. patching and getting that done properly, perhaps having two-factor authentication rolled out quickly enough is not a priority, at least not a primary priority for a lot of IT groups. So we saw an increase in the number of incidents that were being reported. And because we're tracking the data, just to give you an idea, the baseline pre-COVID was X. We saw a 3 to 5 times increase in the number of reported cases, and primarily either in ransomware kind of attacks or what we call business email compromises. This is where hackers will try to get into your mailbox and then intercept to do some kind of social engineering and wire fraud afterwards. So we saw a lot of those type of cases. That actually started right around mid-April all the way through the summer. And what we anticipate, regrettably, is once folks start migrating back to the office, the physical office that they were at before, at some point, there's going to be a second wave because people are going to reconnect their devices at some point, and we do anticipate there being some latent vulnerabilities that are going to be taken advantage of.
Well, something to think about, of course, in terms of the transition. Maybe we'll go to you, John McKay, to follow up on Imran's comments.
Well, all I can speak to is the House of Commons response to post-COVID, and I'm speaking into the computer that is the response, and they marched all of the MPs through the. All of us got this new hardware, which was we were told given the latest software updates. So I have not heard from my colleagues as to whether there have been any breaches of any kind. Possibly there have, but I certainly haven't heard of it. It is a triple security entry point, so it's a fairly secure piece of machinery. I anticipate that this will continue for the foreseeable future. I would think that the two limitations at this point, for us at least, has been not so much bandwidth, but resource width, or resources to run the entire machinery of Parliament. And there has been some frustration around that committees in particular, some committees were given access to resources and others were, if you will, on the waiting list for resources. So from running the, if you will, the government of Canada, which is obviously the largest institution in the country, and Parliament being a subgroup of that large institution, aside from people trying to figure out how to push the mute and the unmute button, it has largely run, I would say, quite smoothly.
The mute problem is certainly something that I think we've all experienced in the last few months. So thank you for that, John. So Dinah, we'll go to you, please.
Sure. I think focusing on more of the operational day-to-day challenges, certainly most organizations, I think, are considering moving to paperless, if not completely, then substantially in a paperless environment, which poses significant challenges, especially for areas where it's simply not feasible to go entirely paperless. There are some areas of law, for instance, that still rely quite heavily on paper documents, whether they're filed with the court or whatnot. So that has been an interesting challenge, because when you're moving into a situation where you're trying to get, say, 1,000 or more of your employees online, leaving aside the security and bandwidth issues that are posed from that sheer quantum of people who are using your VPN, if you're also dealing with a combination of electronic records and paper records, you have this situation where you could potentially be transferring paper records from a home address to your office or from a home address to a client site. And that, of course, has some security concerns in terms of the physical security of, say, the box itself. It seems like that is definitely going to be a challenge for a lot of organizations going forward in terms of how to move away from paper and how to ensure that, to the extent that paper is still used within the organization, that appropriate safeguards are in place. I also think a challenge is in terms of bring your own device policies. So for a lot of us, lawyers, we still like to talk on the phone a lot, and without having a business landline, you run into the situation where if you're working at an organization that has not provided you with, say, a cell phone, or doesn't have Citrix or another soft phone solution on work laptops and desktops, then what do? Do you require employees to use their personal phones for professional use? Is that ethical? Is that the right approach? So I think there are a lot of operational day-to-day challenges that we shouldn't lose sight of in spite of the very big issues that are facing our society. There are some very sort of routine, mundane issues that I think a lot of organizations are struggling to grapple with right now.
It's always good to mention that I think at least the majority of us on this panel are lawyers, so that's good. We may just lose about half, maybe just lost about half our audience there, but
yeah, there we go.
Other than that,
we're
sure
wonderful people.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, we're a little biased, but yeah, it's all good. It's all good. John, we'll go to you next.
You know, I think in the last 6 months, Canada has made more progress in digitization than we've done in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And like Imran said, you know, we're a mid-sized business economy in Canada, and not everybody's as lucky as John to get a laptop from the government of Canada so he could work from home. So what we've seen is that enterprises are requiring their employees to work from home, and in many cases they haven't been provided their own personal equipment, so they have to use their, you know, their laptops and their computers that they have, their family equipment at home, and this is creating a huge risk for the enterprise. And so what happens now is that when you're working in your office tower, you're protected. You have all these firewalls and the intrusion prevention systems, and you have all these protections in place for the employee and for the enterprise. Now all of a sudden, the risk posture of the enterprise has changed dramatically. So now you have a user sitting at home accessing very important critical enterprise data without any of the common protections that they have. So the user is just vulnerable. So what we at Stratejm has done, and you know, we built a security service 5 years ago, which was very innovative at its time. But now, what with our security service, what we can offer end users and enterprises is enterprise-grade security for the end user working at home without having to make huge capital investments. And so we're trying to say, okay, all your users are exposed at home. What are you trying to do, and how best can we do it for you in a very timely manner? So digitization, cloud, and mobility are the two key areas that are driving this, the ability of the economy to continue when everybody's working from home. And now what we're trying to do is to make sure that that can continue for the foreseeable future, but also in a very secure and you know, and a less risky manner.
I want to follow up on something that's been, I think, mentioned a little bit by everyone. So John Menezes, you mentioned how businesses weren't necessarily putting enough concern on this subject and focus on this. John McKay, similar argument for governments. Dinah and Imran speaking maybe about how the personal use of some of these technologies could have impacts for individuals. So let's take a moment and tell ourselves we have some private sector individuals, businesses, and people that would maybe have situations that their personal data and personal laptops and iPads are at risk. Let's take a moment and try and convince them to be concerned. So why should the people in these different scenarios be concerned? How concerned should they be? Let's try to convince people to have a little bit more of a focus on this. So Dinah, we'll start with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a huge risk. It's a huge risk not only from an organizational perspective, but from an individual employee perspective. If we look at the individual perspective, if you are using a personal device and you are working from home, and for instance, you're not careful about using a secure private network to connect to Wi-Fi, it seems simple, but that can pose a lot of challenges in terms of not only your work-related data, but your personal data being accessed by unauthorized people. And I think especially in times of uncertainty, at times when people are afraid, that's when people who want to seek out your personal information for nefarious purposes, that's when they thrive. And I think we've seen an uptick in scammers and attempted hacks over the past 6 months, which is not surprising. So it's incumbent on everyone to be on high alert, not only with respect to their work data, but also their personal data. I also think that earlier on in the pandemic, organizations have realized that they need to be very vigilant in terms of having policies and procedures in place to ensure that their employees are following appropriate security protocol, particularly when using online platforms, whether it's Zoom or Skype or Google. There is a risk of having security breached. And if you're working in the context of, say, a job where you have access to highly confidential information and that's being discussed during a meeting, for example, you want to ensure that you've followed your organization's appropriate protocols to make sure that your meeting isn't breached. These things happen all the time. And I think it's very easy to kind of get a bit complacent, maybe a bit of fatigue in terms of being told again and again about the risks of using personal devices and working from home. But I think we cannot overemphasize the point enough that we are operating under unusual circumstances that poses a lot of challenge from a privacy and security perspective. And I think from an individual viewpoint, it's really just a matter of not only protecting your information in the context of your job, but also just being aware and being savvy. And I think generally the public has become more attuned to their rights vis-a-vis their personal information. I think we are dealing with a public that is aware that their data is theirs, is of value, and that it should be protected. So I think we can't impress the point enough in terms of how important it is that privacy and security is really all of our responsibilities down to the individual.
Fantastic, thank you. John Menezes.
Yeah, I think we haven't seen enough of people's bank accounts, money leaving their bank accounts. So I think many individuals really don't take cybersecurity seriously. And what they do is, you see the amount of data people post on their Facebook pages or the Instagram pages. And while enterprises are focusing a lot on privacy and making sure they can keep their consumers' data private, the actual individual, the actual consumer is for a free coupon on Facebook might give out a whole bunch of private data. So there's kind of like kind of two worlds. In the enterprise world, we're very conscious about securing our data. In our personal lives, we're not so serious about it. I think the issue is that people don't understand that they are linked in a chain. So if your data and if your username and password gets hacked, then that hack has the ability to then hack all your friends' information, and it then has the ability to hack into your enterprise information. So that is why when we're looking at the hackers are now going to your Facebook page, to your Twitter page, they're doing what we call social engineering. So it's not that, if I want to give all the information about John Menezes out in my Facebook page and I'm quite happy and I don't care, the issue becomes is that when I give all that information out on my Facebook page, hackers can take the information that I have in my Facebook page and then target Brian, or can then target Imran. And I think that point is not being made to people. And that's very important, that we're all links in this chain. And it's only the weakest link that we have to worry about that will cause all of us to.
It's a very good point. I think everybody listening is now going to start to ask themselves, how do you sort of check in on your friend requests to make sure that they're all taking cybersecurity seriously? But a very good point. John McKay.
I think the nation would do well with a serious outbreak of paranoia. It's once we did our study, I got to the point where I wouldn't even talk to my wife in front of our thermostat. It just the amount of information that was being gathered on us just was quite devastating. And the biggest statement that drives me absolutely insane is that the person who says, I have nothing to hide. Really? Well, if you have nothing to hide, tell me what's in your bank account. Oh, I wouldn't tell you that. Oh, you must have something to hide then. So, you know, I think, you know, very able people have been talking about the privacy rights, but, and, you know, Brian and I not only share the curse of being lawyers, but we also share the curse of being politicians. And I don't know whether you're on the Huawei list, Brian, but I suspect that I might be on the Huawei list. And that means that your information and my information is floating around Beijing somewhere. My feeling is that Beijing has, you know, may not have my best interests in mind at all times, and that's possibly true of many of the other panelists on this conversation. So I think it started with, as John was saying, money leaving people's bank accounts. The last study the last interview we had was with Desjardins, and it started at 2.5 million accounts and ended up at 5 million accounts. What concerns me in all of these data breaches is that there doesn't seem to be consequence for those who have their data breached. You know, they'll give you a loot bag, or they'll give you a little pat in the back and say, we really love you, but you know, we've still got your money, don't worry about it. I think the consequences to data breaches, particularly in financial institutions, need to be far more serious and easily accessible to people who have had their data breached. The other thing that bears thought is the system itself, in terms of the incentives to share data or to manipulate data. The entire Facebook model is built upon data being exchanged at lightning speed, and it's come to the point where it's actually driving democratic discourse to our detriment. So all of those things are issues that I think the Parliament of Canada should be looking at, and I think it should be looking at sooner than later. And if my colleagues on this panel would push my colleagues in the House of Commons a little bit, maybe we could actually start addressing some of these very serious concerns.
Thank you, John. And I've always been suspicious of my thermostat, so I appreciate that very much. Imran, pourquoi que les gens devraient être préoccupés? Pourquoi que les individus, les gouvernements, pourquoi que les entreprises devront être préoccupés par ceci? Why should all of the different groups be preoccupied and concerned with this?
C'est une très bonne question, Brian, puis plusieurs aspects à cette réponse-là. I'm going to try to address it from a completely different perspective here. Your question was, why should people care about this? And I sort of take us from a different perspective in the sense that, think of the hackers' mindset. Why are they doing this? So if you were to look at a spectrum of the type of attackers that are out there, I'd say close to, and this is anecdotal, but close to 90% would be criminals. Their end goal is to make money. So when you hear on the radio or in media about cyber attacks, denial of service, botnet attacks, and so on, those are just tactics. If you cut through the noise, what the attackers are trying to do is two things: either operationally disrupt the business or the organization to the point they're forced to pay, or on the other hand, steal data to either sell it on the darknet and make money that way, or go back to the organization and say, if you want your data back, you got to pay me. But ultimately, the common denominator is they want to get paid. So with that backdrop, you know, what's happening right now, COVID, or even just prior to COVID, was you have new threat actors which are saying, you know what, you may have backups and you may be able to restore from backups as a SMB or a large organization. Doesn't really matter. It may take you a little bit of time. But if I steal your data on top of it, even if you have backups, you're still going to pay me. So why should people be concerned? Because it's all about the data. And I know we focus a little bit about personal information for consumers and individuals, and that's definitely a big portion of it. But more often than not, when we get that ransom note or that communication from the threat actor, saying, I've got your data. One of the first things that organizations look for is certainly personal information, that's important, any critical R&D information, any competitive intelligence information, any acquisitions that were going on, any legally privileged documents that may be of relevance, or any internal investigation that should not be or would not normally be made public. There's a variety in there when you talk about data that's out there that matters to an organization. So what I typically say to our clients is, look, just think about your mailbox for a minute. How long have you been with that organization? What do you use it for? How do you use it? Who may have sent you a spreadsheet with information, personal data or otherwise? Just imagine for a minute, what are you privy to? That's the risk. And what hackers are trying to do, like I mentioned earlier, is take 1 or 2 points of vulnerability in that triangle that I mentioned to be able to get into the organization, somehow monetize that access afterwards.
Well, anybody listening to this should certainly be aware that we should all be concerned, and that includes governments, businesses, and individuals. So let's maybe now talk about solutions. What can all of these groups also do to try to protect Canadians, protect the institutions that they're with? So John McKay, we'll start with you. I'd be curious for you, with your perspective, what can governments do to protect Canadians, to protect their own government, of course, and their own operations, but essentially what role can they play with regards to ensuring that Canada is where it needs to be when it comes to cybersecurity?
Well, I'd start with the bully pulpit. The Prime Minister and ministers of the Crown have a serious bully pulpit that can alert people to problems and educate them, because this is moving at literally the speed of light, and so it's very hard for a legislature to keep ahead of the issues. The second area would be, I think we should come to ground on what constitutes privacy, and I would kind of work on a presumption that all data is private unless there's clear on open consent that it's not private. The third area I would look into is consequences for breach of data, and that was one of the ones that came out of our study, was that here's 5 million accounts have gone into the dark web. I have no idea what happened to those 5 million accounts. I don't know how they were manipulated. I don't know how they were used. I don't know what the consequences were for the account holders. But there appeared to be no consequences for the financial institution, other than some reputational damage and a few press conferences saying that we really take our cybersecurity seriously. So in that particular instance, it was an internal hacker or an internal disgruntled employee or something of that nature that released all that information. Again, on a class action lawsuit basis, I would work on the assumption that, or work on the presumption that the institution would have a presumption against it and have to demonstrate in some means or another that it had taken all reasonable measures to prevent that data breach. So consequences, if you will, real consequences, meaningful consequences, quick consequences for data breaches by large institutions.
Thank you, John. Very, very poignant points all around, especially the part where you say that it's ever evolving, so it can make it a bit difficult for maybe institutions that can't keep up with that pace. So Imran, we'll go to you. What can governments do to try to make sure that Canada is as cyber secure as possible?
So there are a couple of studies that are out there that have directly correlated a good response with preparation. And in some cases, they've actually quantified that if you prepare on the front end, you're going to end up paying the impact of that incident 5 times less. We have to work with the assumption at some point organizations, and they're victims, organizations that get hacked into, barring, negligence, they are victims of cyber criminals who are taking advantage of vulnerabilities. I think what organizations need to be judged on in many cases is going to be how they respond to the incident. And the speed and quality of the response is heavily contingent on the preparation that they have in place beforehand, which is contingent on the technical piece, which I'm sure John can speak to, but also on the governance piece that Dinah mentioned a bit earlier that I agree with. If you've got a simple cyber incident response plan, which is flexible enough and really addresses the key issues, you can get to notifying the right people, either government entities or individuals, quicker. If you know what kind of data you keep and where you keep it, it's going to be easier to investigate and get a result sooner rather than reviewing every single thing under the sun. So there are things organizations can take. There are very simple steps from a governance standpoint that certainly we have recommended our clients to implement, and from a technical standpoint that need to be put in place as well. But I would mention that, by and large, I'd say most of the clients that we work with, they have been victim of an incident. They had all the best intentions and effort implemented in being cyber secure. But then the question is, how are they responding? That should be really the metric on which we judge and measure folks.
Very interesting as well. And you're right to say there's certainly two different times in which would require different actions. So thank you for that. So John, we'll go to you.
So my biggest concern is that government is too slow. And I think the government is going to spend the next 3 years legislating for problems that occurred in the previous 5.
True.
And that's the major issue. We see that with all the tech giants in the US, where they're legislating to solve problems that are occurring today and not for problems that are going to occur in the next 3 to 5 to 7 years. So that's one of my biggest issues with government. The second thing is government doesn't have all the expertise and is always late to the party bringing expertise from the private sector. I think our federal government, our provincial governments need to involve the private sector, bring in the expertise early on. And if they're going to do legislation, it's look at what problems we anticipate in the next 3 to 5 years, and then sort of come out with legislation that's going to help us. Because I'm afraid that the legislation that they're going to come out is going to be no better than GDPR that's been implemented in Europe last year. And if that's the case, then why don't you simply implement GDPR and move on instead of going through this long process of trying to develop new legislation? The industry is changing. We're talking about 5G, so that 5G is going to make it easier for people to do work remotely. Security is going to be an even bigger problem, and so government needs to figure out, okay, society as we know it today, and especially in the post-COVID-19 world, is going to be very different than it was yesterday. So let's stop trying to solve the problems or legislate for problems of yesterday and look forward to the next 5 years. So the Prime Minister is talking about the throne speech that's coming on September 23rd about the future of Canada. I think one of the big pieces of the future of Canada is going to be cybersecurity. Everything is going to be online. Your home is going to be online. So you've got to figure out, okay, what do we do about this? And it's not just about data. It's about automation. It's about robotics. It's all these. It's about our grid. Our grid. Everything's going to be online. So we need to figure out what we're going to do, and it's no longer just hackers sitting in some basement. These are nation states that are coming after us. So we've got to be, thinking 3-4 steps ahead if we're going to be successful. Otherwise, we can be having the same panel discussion 5 years from now, and we'll be talking about the same problems.
Well, we better put that in the calendar already for the 5 of us to get together in 5 years to see how we did. Dinah, over to you.
Sure. John raises an interesting point in terms of GDPR. Although it's very stringent and sort of the first omnibus privacy law of its kind, although PIPEDA, our federal privacy law in Canada, obviously predates GDPR. But I think what the GDPR does really well is the quantum of fines it can levy. So if you're talking about, say, 20 million euros under the GDPR for a breach of its provisions versus, say, $20,000 under PIPEDA for not reporting a breach fast enough, I don't know how compelling, a $20,000 fine, for example, will be to an organization. It's probably a rounding error. So I think the point was made earlier in terms of pushing greater accountability and greater ramifications in the event that there is a breach that is found to be on the shoulders of the organization itself. So I think there's definitely an argument for bolstering our privacy and security laws. so that organizations really take it seriously. And you know, the fact is, it's usually the bottom line that makes organizations take these things seriously. So I think there's definitely a case for giving sharper teeth to our legislation from an enforcement perspective. And the only other thing I would add is, in addition to sort of the legal damages perspective, I also think government has a really important role in terms of instilling trust in the public in terms of how their information is going to be used. So with contact tracing and collecting race-based data and seeing how that relates to instances of COVID-19, this is all very valuable information and very necessary efforts that the government has undertaken to protect us. But these efforts are only as good as people are willing to contribute to them. So I think the fact that, for example, the COVID alert app that was released last month, it really went into detail in terms of its privacy notice and really writing it in plain speak human language so that the public could really understand what they were signing up for when downloading the app to their phone. And the fact that that notice was drafted in consultation with appropriate stakeholders as well as the public, I think really is very effective in terms of bolstering public trust in our government to take certain steps that are really unprecedented, but necessary in light of the situation that we're in. So I think the legislative component is really important, but also the interaction with the public and explanation as to how their information will be used is very important.
Brian, if I could add one quick point or two very quickly, because I think there's an important nuance to be made here. When we talk about privacy legislation, we have to also realize in Canada, we're in a federation. We are moving, it's very difficult to get legislation which is sufficiently harmonized across all provinces in the federal sphere. GDPR being implemented in Canada verbatim is not doable. There's a Canadian twist to it. Quebec already is moving in that direction with Bill 64 that was introduced. Ontario is looking at private sector privacy legislation, which probably will be modeled on that. And then PIPEDA is up for an update. But to come back to your question, which I probably should have added in when I was speaking earlier, was on the government side, one piece that from a policy standpoint may make sense and has been implemented in the UK, has been implemented in Australia. So countries which are comparable in size and scope and the kind of threats they're facing, which are G7 countries, similar type of economies, and so on, is the idea of having a cybersecurity czar or some kind of cybersecurity agency responsible for this. Right now, although we have made strides in terms of what the CSC reorganization was with various levels of law enforcement, and that was a very positive step to coordinate efforts, we do need an organization like that for the following and simple reason. Canada, as a G7 country, we have limited resources to invest in certain areas of R&D. So when you think of acoustic research, we have clusters that we invest in. Those clusters ever being compromised by state actors from a national security standpoint would raise significant concerns for me. And so having someone or a group of folks who are going to be looking at that day in and day out and not having that conflated with other mandates that may be ancillary or competing is going to be a key component. So from a policy standpoint, we wouldn't be breaking new ground, but it'd be very similar to what we have in other jurisdictions as well.
Brian, if I may just respond, because a number of interesting points were raised. Maybe we should move up our reunion from 5 years to 1. Only because the thing is moving at lightning speed. So my committee looked after C59, and which was a pretty significant initiative in terms of trying to bring everybody under the same roof. And I'd be interested in John's thoughts with respect to the cyber center that was stood up so that the both government and private sectors, certainly the large players in private sector, got together on a fairly regular basis to exchange data and problems. I'd be interested in knowing whether he thinks that's working, or is it too early to say. And I'm also interested in knowing whether they think that the provisions that were put in are actually working. I share the paranoia about having big tech and big government putting apps together. My son talked me down from the COVID app, which I think Diana rightly has described as information that cannot be breached and has got sufficient privacy protections. But sorry, Brian, I interrupted.
No, fantastic point, and I'm now going to ask, because we have a few questions that have come in from the audience. So I'm going to just go to one panelist for each question, and if you could take maybe about 30 seconds to a minute, because we only have a few minutes left, it would be greatly appreciated. So John Menezes, I'll go to you. What can businesses do? And to John McKay's point, was the cyber center and involving some of the big players, was that a good move? And what else could businesses do to ensure that they're making the country cyber secure?
I think one of the biggest things that the businesses can do is to invest in cybersecurity awareness training for all their employees, because like I keep saying, the hackers are targeting the weakest link, and the weakest link are employees. And it's unfortunate, but we do what we call phishing campaigns, and we find that 20 to 25% of the people click on the links even after attending the training. So we think that enterprises, governments, and I really think it should start in schools, where we have the cybersecurity awareness training. We make everybody aware that just because you got an email that says it's coming from your MP doesn't really mean it's coming from your MP, and that you need to do a little bit of due diligence to make sure that you click on the link, it's a real link, and you're not going to get your machine infected. So I think at a very basic level, if we could just be the education about cybersecurity and the risks of cybersecurity, if we can just spend a little time and money in that, I think it'll be well for all of us.
Well, it's a great segue. I'm going to go back to you, John, because we have one question that certainly gives you a bit of a compliment here. So the person wrote, most everyday people that I speak to do not take their privacy or cybersecurity seriously, even when they know better. I agree with the Honorable John McKay that we need an outbreak of paranoia. What is the Canadian government doing? And I'll add, what can it do to encourage Canadians to take their cybersecurity and privacy more seriously? So, John.
So is this which John?
John McKay, sorry.
Oh, okay. Whatever the government of Canada is doing to take cybersecurity more seriously is not nearly sufficient. Because John rightly identifies 25% of the people who, even after training, don't do it, and I, among those probably in that 25%, don't practice cyber hygiene, which I thought was frankly a big cop-out on the part of both government and business, that somehow or another is my responsibility to practice cyber hygiene. Post-COVID, I'm not convinced as much that it is a cop-out. So cyber hygiene is a serious issue. I'm quite prepared to say that I've come around on that. But I also think that the government, and John, I'm not quite sure whether I'm going to put money on this, but if there is a mention of cyber in the throne speech, I would be very surprised. Even though I think it is a very significant issue. So as I say, I'm not at all convinced that what could be done is being done.
Thank you, John. So 2 quick questions for Dinah and Imran. So Dinah, we had one audience member say that they believe Facebook, and I'll add probably other large tech companies, aren't doing enough about cybersecurity. This audience member thinks that Facebook wouldn't be doing anything with regards to cybersecurity. Are the big players doing enough? And if not, what could they be doing?
No, I think the big players need to lead by example. And I think if you look at what's gone on in the news with some of the big social media companies over the past year or so, it's indicative of the fact that they need to be doing more. I think that the fact that they're delivering a service that prompts people to divulge vast quantities of personal information, it's not good enough to have a privacy policy that basically reads like a very obtuse novel and say, well, we told you we're going to sell your data. It's right there in paragraph G sub 7. And the fact that you didn't read it, well, that's not on us. I think that's not appropriate. And I think it's going to take perhaps a few more hearings, a few more substantial fines, and also I think it's going to take individuals saying enough is enough. We demand greater accountability and clarity from the organizations. And I think it's also a responsibility on the part of the organization to make sure that they are transparent in their information handling practices. But also, it's one thing to say, well, we can ask for this data, but again, going back to the ethical point, should they be asking for the data? And I think that nuance is often lost in the corporate setting, and it needs to be revisited, especially in social media contexts where you are essentially, the commodity is individuals' data, those who use your platform. So there's a responsibility attached to the use of that data. And I think from the individual perspective, again, just reinforcing the point that you need to protect yourself. You do need to read privacy notices, even if it's the last thing you want to do when you sign up for a service. And also just be cognizant of the fact that any information you put out there is really there more or less permanently, and to make sure that you're not losing sight of the fact that you do kind of lose control of your information to a certain extent when you post it online. So bolstering that sophistication on the part of the individual is key, but I still think that organizations, particularly social media companies, need to do more.
Thank you, Dinah. Imran, John mentioned that the employees could very well be the weakest link within organizations. So within about 30 seconds, 45 seconds, what could all of the people listening that are employees working from home especially, what can they do to, as the other John mentioned, practice cyber hygiene?
It's going to sound quite obvious and trite, but it's vigilance, just being very careful. It goes without saying, but when you do get an email, we're being asked to do a lot more with limited resources, either time-wise or otherwise. Taking that extra step to verify if the sender is legitimate, to verify if the banking details that are being provided are legitimate and make sense. Being very skeptical of what comes in and just double checking things, that's really key. But from an organization standpoint, if I had to sort of flip it around, I would give the example of the old UK houses. I don't know if anybody's been there, but back in the day, if you went to an old UK house, every room you entered was locked. And so your footprint, think of a digital footprint as being expansive. If you break into a house, you can get access to the whole house, you have access to everything. If we can lock up what is required and what is not required, you're really reducing your digital footprint from an organizational standpoint, the risk that goes with cyber.
Great visual, Imran. Thank you so much. We have somebody that has hacked our webinar. Andrew has joined on the screen there. So over to you, Andrew. You might still be on mute there, Andrew, which is the story of the pandemic.
Which is the story, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Andrew, still don't hear you. I'm not. There we go. We got it.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Brian, for moderating the panel so wonderfully as you guided us through a lot of rather complex topics in a way that all of us could understand. Thank you to John Menezes for being here, being part of this. You're a leading practitioner in this field. It was important to have your voice as part of this discussion. Thank you too to your company Stratejm for being a sponsor today. Dinah Maxwell and Imran Ahmad, thank you for sharing the incredible legal background you have and the experience you have with a lot of your clients. And John McKay, a couple of things. Thanks for sharing with us what's happening in the House or what's not happening in the House. Equally important. And I look forward to you taking this back to your government and Parliament. And we'll be watching certainly next week Throne Speech to see if it is mentioned, and if not, we'll look to you to be going to the barricades on this issue.
Yeah.
One comment I do want to make for all of you to Dinah's point that she made earlier, you really kept the discussion in language that was simple and straightforward, even though most of you are lawyers. You talked like the rest of us today, so thank you for doing that. It really is an important and complex issue, and far too often people who work in these areas, in various areas that are complex, talk in a language that the rest of the population doesn't understand. So it was important for you to do that, and thanks for letting us all be part of this important discussion. Yeah, I do have that feeling, John McKay, of not going too near my thermostat for the next little while. To the audience, thank you for watching. I do want to tell you that we'll be having webinars every week or so. So please keep in touch with our website and keep watching and joining us. To the panel, thank you for doing this. Now, you can't hear the audience clapping, so what I'm going to suggest is that we all clap for each other as we go out. Thank you very much.
Merci tout le monde. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well done, Brian.
Bye-bye. Thanks.